will officially kick off the session. My name is Jason Turflinger. I head up the American Chamber of Commerce in Norway. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome Bruce Stokes and my counterparts and all of you fellow AmCham members and representatives of AmCham members around the Nordics. As I mentioned just a couple minutes ago, we're going to continue to have people logging in for the first couple minutes. Do mute your microphones and do keep your video turned off. Bruce Stokes will present for the first half of this hour, and then we will have the option or the ability to ask him some questions. And when you're asking these questions, you can do it by raising your digital hand, of course, or asking in the chat function. When you ask questions in the chat function, please do identify yourself. Most names are already there, but please do identify your company. If you are having technical difficulties, which we hope there are not many of, please email those to amcham@amcham.no. Do not, or we don't want to tie up the chat function with technical challenges. Again, technical challenges, email to amcham@amcham.no. Thank you, Tyler. We also have a note that we will be recording this session, so please note that. And I think that's all the practical notes I have here. Tyler will continue admitting people on the fly here. I want to introduce my Nordic counterparts in a second, but I start off by saying, Bruce, what a roller coaster ride. You know, we had a test call last week, and the set of issues that we were discussing on that test call were completely different than the issues we are discussing now. How does this all play into voter sentiment and what they'll be deciding at the ballot box or when they mail in their ballots over the coming weeks is anyone's guess what impact that will have. But we'll come back to that and save that. If I can just briefly we'll take a quick round of the Nordics, AmCham, starting off with Peter Dahlen in AmCham Sweden.
Thank you, Jason, and thanks to you and your team for hosting this important conversation today. So our Nordic AmCham collaboration, it's more important than ever as we navigate these strange times is an understatement. But I want to thank you, Bruce, as well for sharing your insights today on what is clearly a closely watched election season. And I want to welcome AmCham Sweden's members, and we're looking forward to hearing your questions later after Bruce's presentation. And with that, I'll turn things over to my good friend Alexandra at AmCham Finland.
Hello, everyone. I'm Alexandra Pasternak-Jackson. I'm the CEO of AmCham Finland, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Jason and AmCham Norway, the entire team, for hosting us. Thank you, Bruce, for being here, and to my AmCham colleagues, and a special tervetuloa to our Finnish members and stakeholders who are calling in. We've had the pleasure of hearing Bruce before, and you always leave these conversations with some insights. So we are greatly looking forward to your questions and answers. And with that, I will hand the con over to Stephen.
Thanks, Alexandra, and good afternoon, everyone from Copenhagen. I'm Steve Brugger. I'm the Executive Director of AmCham in Denmark. Number one, welcome to all the AmCham Denmark members on the call today, and we also look forward to hearing your questions. It's going to be a great session with Bruce. Bruce, great to have you with us again. Always enjoy engaging with you. You have a lot of great insights. We look forward to hearing that. And once again, thanks to AmCham Norway and your team, Jason, for setting this up. So we look forward to a great session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. And Bruce, I was going back in the records trying to determine, you were here in Oslo and I believe Copenhagen in April 16. Obviously, travel was a bit easier back then, but we certainly appreciated that, and we've had a great working relationship since then. So again, reflected in Steve's words and all my counterparts, thank you very much for spending the next hour with us. Before we kick off, a proper introduction of Bruce Stokes. He is Cambridge, Massachusetts based these days, and he is a non-resident Transatlantic Fellow at the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C. If I could ask everyone to mute their microphones, unless you are Bruce or me at this time, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. Bruce is the Executive Director of the Transatlantic Task Force, Together or Alone, Choices and Strategies for Transatlantic Relations for 2021 and beyond. Previously, Bruce was the Director of Global Economic Attitudes at the Pew Research Center and is a former international economics columnist for the Washington-based public policy magazine National Journal. Bruce is also a former senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. During his earlier tenure at the German Marshall Fund, Bruce authored two key reports, Dates for Renewing Transatlantic Capitalism and A New Era for Transatlantic Trade Leadership. Bruce is also the co-author of the 2006 book, America Against the World, How We Are Different and Why We Are Disliked. Obviously, somewhat of a recurring sentiment, Bruce. Stokes is a graduate of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, the School for Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and he attended the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University. Bruce, we certainly look forward to getting your take on the mood of the American voter these days and how it will shape the next U.S. administration. Again, after your presentation here, we will open the floor to questions from my colleagues and from our virtual floor. Again, use the hand or chat function. You can use the chat function at any point and save the virtual hands for after Bruce's presentation, please. Include your company name in the chat function. And just to save you all from writing cramps, the slides will indeed be made available after today's presentation. Bruce, the virtual floor is yours, sir.
Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me. I remember fondly that trip to Denmark and Norway in 2016, and I suppose at the time I probably said, oh, I think Clinton's probably going to win. So take everything I'm about to say with a grain of salt, I think. And I really appreciate everyone on the call, and I look forward to your questions. That's how I learn, because your questions help me understand how others are seeing the U.S. political scene, and give us some insights that we need to pursue in our analysis of what's going on in politics in the U.S. The first slide is the state of the U.S. presidential election. Now, as you can imagine, the state is changing almost day by day. As was mentioned, we started out last week with news of the president only spending $750 in paying $750 in taxes in 2015 and 2016, or 2016, 2017. And by the end of the week, the topic had disappeared and we were on to a whole different set of issues. The president got coronavirus. So we had a presidential debate in the middle of that. So the state of the election is certainly in flux. But one thing we do know about this election, in the next slide, is that more voters say this election really matters, and it really matters who wins, than really at any point in the last 20 years. The sense of the importance of this among the voters is quite high, dramatically high. 8 in 10 say it's very important. On the next slide, you can see that this is the president's approval rating. It's a standard question that almost all pollsters ask. This is the Gallup poll over the last year, and you can see that the president is at 42% approval. In a poll that came out by NBC and the Wall Street Journal just yesterday, he's at 43% approval. So that, I would say, probably roughly where it stands. For those of you who watch American politics, you know there's a plethora of polls out there. be very careful about the provenance of these polls. It's still considered that the best polls are telephone surveys where a human being talks to another human being. They aren't online. They aren't done randomly. My sense is, in working in polling for almost a decade, is don't take any poll as gospel. See where the most trusted polls are circling, and that gives you a better sense of the state of the race. One thing we do know, though, from this approval rating is that it's highly partisan. This is from a series of Pew polls going back and Gallup polls going back to 1953. Approval of the president has always been partisan, but what you will notice there is the partisan gap in approval of the president has grown bigger over time. That the partisan gap in approval of Trump is bigger than the partisan gap that existed on approval of Obama, and it was pretty big. And the partisan gap in approval of Obama was bigger than the partisan gap in approval of George W. Bush. So we are becoming a much more divided country in terms of our partisan views. When voters have been asked what are the important issues in this 2020 election, not surprisingly, in the next slide, you can see it's the economy, it's healthcare. Interestingly, that 64% say it is very important, that the Supreme Court appointees are very important. That's a little higher than I would have expected, because this survey was done before Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, but it was already a very important issue. Notice what is not very important down at the bottom: climate change and abortion. One issue that's very important on the left, and the other is an issue very important on the right. But overall, the American public do not see these issues as very important relatively. What is interesting,
Bruce, if I can, sorry to interrupt already, but does foreign policy include trade policy?
You know, the problem in writing these surveys is you can't ask too many priorities. Trade, and I'll show you later, trade policy, trade issues are really not that important to the American public. They're certainly important to the listeners on this call. We can argue they're very important for the economy. But for example, Pew does a survey every January. So in election years and non-election years, they say, what is the most important issues facing the nation over the next 12 months? They have a longer list than this. Trade is one of them. And for 20 years, and asking this question, trade is either the least important issue to the American public in January of that year, or the second least important, with climate change being less important sometimes than trade policy.
Right. I was hoping you were going to say that trade policy was included in there, and that we had done pretty well in the list of our priorities.
Now, look, I mean, one of the things you have to realize about when you ask the public questions, you really don't know what they were thinking when they heard the question. Do they include trade policy in their judgment about the economy? Do they include it when they're thinking about foreign policy? Possibly, to a certain extent, but it wasn't explicitly asked in this question. And frankly, it's not that big of an issue in this election. So moving right along, what is interesting, if you look at the question of, what's very important to your vote in this presidential election, you get a partisan break, just as you get a partisan break in approval of the president. Trump supporters are more likely to say the economy is very important than are Biden supporters, even though it's 7 in 10 Biden supporters, it's 9 in 10 Trump supporters. Healthcare, Democrats are much more likely to say, or Biden voters are much more likely to say it's important than Trump supporters. Supreme Court nominations, again, interesting. This was done, as I said, in late July, early August. 6 in 10 of each basically said it was important. Go down to the bottom there, and you can see that income inequality, much more important to Democrats than Republicans, or Biden voters to Trump voters. climate change even more by 7-1. Biden supporters are much more likely to say it's important than Trump supporters. If we go to the next slide, people were asked who would do a better job dealing with some of these problems. And the public, these are all registered voters, acknowledged that the Democratic Party would do better handling climate change. Interestingly, that they think the Democrats would do a better job handling abortion and contraception, although bear in mind that a majority of Americans now support abortion. They think Democrats would do better handling health care, which obviously is and the health impact of COVID, which is obviously a big issue in this election. But if you look down at the bottom, people believe that the Republicans will do a better job handling the economy and terrorism. One final issue on the state of this election that I think is, in many ways, I think this is the most one of the more important slides. This is a look done by Bruce Millman, who is a Republican consultant, looking at elections going back to 1912, presidential elections. And when there was no recession in the 2 years before the election, and a president was up for re-election, that president won re-election every time, going back to 1912, when there had been no recession within 2 years before the election. When there was a recession 2 years before the election, presidents who were seeking re-election, 5 of the 6 who faced that challenge lost. Obviously, we've had a recession before this election. You know, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but this is a pretty powerful statement that, as the Clinton campaign used to say, James Carville for the Clinton campaign used to say years ago in 1992, it's the economy, stupid. I think it's probably not quite apt today because it's more than the economy, stupid, but this is a pretty powerful challenge for the Trump re-election. In terms of where we stand in the race today, the slide you have in front of you is from the ABC News Washington Post poll that came out about a week ago. The Biden was ahead by 10 points in that poll, although his margin of lead shrunk when you included some third-party candidates who will be on the ballot in at least some states. And remember that one of the reasons Clinton lost in 2016 is there were third-party candidates on the ballot. But there's been a more recent poll that's come out by NBC News and Wall Street Journal just yesterday that had Biden ahead by 14 points. So, and what's the difference between this ABC News poll and the NBC News poll is that the ABC News poll was taken before the debates. The NBC News poll was taken after the debates. And it would appear that the debates helped Biden and hurt Trump. By 2-1, people thought Biden, in the NBC News poll, by 2-1, people thought Biden won that debate. Now, of course, the impact of that debate has been, I think, obliterated by the president testing positive for COVID. So we just don't know what impact that will have, whether it will create a sympathy vote for the president, whether people will say he's not ready to be reelected. We got to go with it, hold our nose and vote for the Democrat. We just don't know, and that's going to have to play out over time. What is interesting in this Washington Post ABC News poll, and I think bears noting, is that Biden leads Trump among women by 31 points. Trump leads Biden among men. Notice on the next set of lines that Trump holds a very strong lead among non-college graduates by about 6 points, whereas Biden's lead among college graduates is 30 points. So there's a real division among voters that is, among other things, dependent on gender and education. Trump leads among whites by 6 points. Biden leads among blacks by 79 points. And if you go down to near the very bottom, I think what's interesting is that Trump leads among white evangelical Protestants by 3-1, by 50 points. That's a huge portion of his base. But interestingly, given the comments the president made about the military, about people in the military and that they're losers, etc., the divide in military households is right down the middle. Does this reflect the fact that he's lost support among the military, or Biden has gained support? We just don't know. But it is interesting. One, I think, might have expected, I certainly would have expected that the president would do better among military households. Finally, one thing to think about, because, and in many ways, I think this is the most important slide to look at and to realize this may determine the outcome of the election. In 2016, the president was successful because, in large part, because he got lowly educated white people to vote who had not voted ever or had rarely voted. And he got them to turn out in record numbers. His entire campaign seems to be focused on that base. And many political professionals have questioned whether that's smart. Why don't you try to grow your base? But it would appear that he's focused on these numbers, which is that if you look at some of the swing states, the battleground states, Michigan and Minnesota, New Hampshire and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, these numbers under non-college whites on this chart are non-college whites who did not vote in 2016. In other words, even though the president got a lot of non-college whites to vote in 2016, there's still a lot who didn't vote. And those numbers outnumber the number of college whites or non-whites in those states who didn't vote. So if this campaign is really about mobilizing your base, the president has an untapped base of non-college whites in some of the battleground states that's larger than the untapped base that Biden has in those states. So it really is a question of who can turn out their base more and more successful at it. Now, it is true that Biden has opportunities in the Sun Belt where college whites and non-whites outnumber the non-college whites who didn't vote in 2016. So it's really a battle of turnout and who is more successful at that. And moving right along, behind the numbers, what's driving public sentiment. I'm going to go through this very fast, but I just want to point out to you that Erik Erikson, the great child psychologist, who was, interestingly enough, Austrian, and maybe had the powers of observation that a foreigner coming to this country would have, wrote in 1950 that this dynamic country subjects its inhabitants to more extreme contrasts and abrupt changes during a lifetime or a generation than is normally the case with other nations. I submit to you that one of the things driving the Trump election in 2016 and continues to drive support for change in America, or resistance to change more accurately, is the fact that we have subjected our people in the United States to a more rapid degree of change than any people have experienced in other societies in a short period of time. The number of non-white people in the society has tripled in the last half century. The number of foreign-born people has tripled in the last half century. Church membership has gone down by a third. The portion of the workforce in manufacturing has gone down by 2/3. These are rapid changes, and it's not that societies don't experience change over time. It's just I think we underappreciate how rapid the pace of change has been. If you look at the American dream, the idea that your children will be better off than you are, and that gives you faith in the country and the society. For those people who were born the year I was born, we had an 80% chance of earning more money than our fathers. I did, certainly. In the year my daughter was born, near the end of this graph, at the bottom there, her generation only has a 50% chance of making more money than their parents. That's a huge diminution of the American dream. Part of it has to do because wage growth has been so slow. I would dare say almost all of us on this call are in the highest quintile in terms of income in the United States. Our wages have gone up fairly well over the last 30 years. The middle quintile, the middle class, has only gone up, their wages have only gone up 6%. So they're upset, they're frustrated. And there's also the rural urban divide in the United States. This shows the employment rates since the Great Recession. And as you can see, metro areas employment has rebounded. We're now at about 106% of what it was in 2007, but non-metro employment has stagnated. It's below what it was in 2007 and seems to be flatlining. Finally, the other change we've put our people through, and it's actually a reflection of the frustration with the other changes, is that we have an increasingly unstable political system. Certainly, change in America in the political system is normal. As my father used to say, he was a Goldwater voter, and he would say, sometimes you have to throw the bums out and get new bums. But I think there is a question about whether the pace of change in the political leadership has reached the point of dysfunctionality. In the 20 years between 1960 and 1978, we had 3 changes in either the House, the Senate, or the White House. In other words, change of party control change of one of those 3, or maybe more than one of those 3, but only 3 times in 10 elections over 20 years between 1960 and 1978. Between 1980 and 1998, we had 4 such changes. Between 2000 and 2018, we have had 8 changes in control of the House, the Senate, and or the White House. That means that almost every election something flips. I think that's both a reflection of growing dissatisfaction by the population, by the electorate. My father's dictum, throw the bums out and get new bums. But there's also, it seems to me, I think we have to acknowledge that when you have that kind of volatility in the political system, it's really hard to get anything done because you're yo-yoing back and forth in terms of policy control. What's interesting is that with all this change going on, Trump voters basically say they think we shouldn't be changing as much. We should rely on longstanding principles, whereas Biden supporters believe that one of the strengths of America is the ability to change. So there's a huge disconnect between Biden voters who see change positively and Trump voters who see change negatively. To delve rapidly and deeply into some of these other issues, you all know that we are demographically changing America. I think you probably don't appreciate how fast it is. The non-white population in the United States has grown 76% since the year 2000. The white population has only grown 24%. The fastest growing group are Hispanics. If you look at the political affiliations of these different groups, whites are still, a majority of whites are Republicans, but those divisions haven't really changed over the last couple of decades, whereas Hispanics are slightly becoming more Democratic in their leanings. Blacks have remained very committed to the Democratic Party. And what is interesting, remember that Asians are a rapidly growing subset of the American population, and they are increasingly voting and self-identifying as Democrats. On the next slide, you can see, what has, I would say, limited the impact of the demographic change on the political process up to this point, and that is that whites vote at a much higher rate than minorities. This has always been the case, and it was very striking in 2016, where roughly 2/3 of whites voted, and only 60% of blacks voted, down from 67% in 2012. And what this, I think, tells us about the 2020 election is that Biden has to get more of that 2/3 of the white vote that voted than Clinton did. And Biden also needs to get votes from blacks who didn't vote. In other words, that 60% participation rate by blacks in 2016 has got to go up if Biden's going to win, because they will, almost all of them will vote for Biden. So one thing to watch is the turnout rate among blacks. I don't think it'll go back up to 67% under Obama for understandable reasons, but it's got to be higher than 60%. What is interesting is Asians are slowly increasing their participation rate. But look at it; it's still only less than half of Asians vote, and less than half of Hispanics vote. So the turnout for Biden among minority groups is going to have to increase if he has a chance of winning. On the next slide, we can see that part of the divisions in the society are difference between Biden voters and Trump voters on how they see some of these racial and gender issues. Basically, Biden voters, 3/4 of Biden voters say that it's much more difficult to be a black person in the United States. Only 1 out of 10 Trump voters agree with that. And if you look at the bottom, again, it's 8 in 10 Biden voters say women face more significant problems, whereas Trump voters, only 1/4 of them say women face more problems than men in our society. So on some of these racial and gender issues, you see real differences in public perception. Moving right along, just to give you a sense of how all this impacts on the electoral process, you can see that in that left-hand column that 40% of Democratic voters are non-white. So the Democratic Party is increasingly dependent on the non-white vote. It was only 1/4 back in 1994. It is interesting the Republicans have tripled the percentage of their votes that come from non-white. So it's not that the Republicans aren't gaining some support in non-white communities. It's just they still trail the Democratic Party. And if you look at the right-hand column, the share of voters who are white non-college graduates, the share of overall voters who are non-white college graduates is going down because the society is better educated. More people are going to college. What is interesting is that the Democratic Party has lost 27 percentage points among that subgroup since 1994, whereas the Republican Party has only lost 11 percentage points. So in terms of a shrinking number of people who don't have a college education, the Republicans are retaining more of those votes than are the Democrats. So education is a very important indicator in this election. Here are some other indicators to look at and to understand. 8 in 10 Republicans, white evangelicals are Republicans. They represent 18% of the vote, and they are overwhelmingly Republican. White non-college men represent 22% of the population, and by 2 to 1, they are Republicans. Whereas among Democrats, white college plus women, in other words, women who have graduated from college may actually have a graduate degree, represent 13% of the population, and a little less than by 2 to 1, they are Democrats. Millennial women by 2 to 1 are Democrats. So you see how we are breaking along racial and gender and educational lines, and actually also along rural urban lines. Look at up above there. Rural Southerners are only 7% of the vote, but they are basically 27 percentage points more likely to be Republican than Democrats. Moving along again to views on international issues.
Bruce, if I could just briefly, I know it's Mission Impossible, but 5 minutes, if possible.
Okay, sure.
Thank
you. Definitely. Look at this list. This is from a Chicago Council poll that just came out. When asked what are the most important issues facing the country over the next decade, Republicans say China is number 1, international terrorism number 2, large numbers of immigrants number 3. Democrats say it's COVID, climate change, and racial inequality. We have totally different views of the major issues facing the country. If you look more specifically at about what should be done about foreign policy issues, by more than 3-to-1, Republicans would like to see an increase in drone strikes. By almost 5-to-1, they would like to see more sanctions placed on other countries. They would like to see more tariffs imposed on other countries. Democrats in the next slide basically overwhelmingly want to participate in more in international organizations. So if Biden is elected, there will be strong support for rejoining Paris, rejoining the WHO, being more active in the UN and the WTO. If you look at the next slide, what is interesting is 62% of Americans, that green number on the right-hand side, say that we should coordinate and collaborate with other countries to solve global issues. But look at the partisan difference. By 2-to-1, Democrats say that over Republicans. So there's a real division here in this election. After the election, if Biden wins, there'll be support for greater international cooperation. If Trump wins, his supporters don't believe we need it. And you can see this in the next slide, which is from Pew. If you look at the bottom slide, for example, which is interesting, countries around the world should act as a global community. 90% of Democrats say that. 53% of Republicans say that. Now, it is interesting that a majority of Republicans say that. So depending on how the question is worded, you get a little more Republican support for international cooperation. On issues of trade that I know are near and dear to the heart of the listeners, there are various ways to ask this question. This is the way Gallup asks it. As you can see, this idea that Americans are inherently protectionist is no longer supported by the data. 8 in 10 Americans say trade is good for the country. But I would warn you, when Pew asks a similar question, they get roughly the same numbers when you ask them if, in a principled way, is trade good for the country? When you ask a more specific question, does trade create jobs? No, people don't believe that. Does trade raise wages? No, they don't believe that. Does trade lower prices? No, they don't believe that. So the takeaway I always get from this is that Americans believe in trade in principle. They don't necessarily believe it's good for them. They don't believe it's good in practice. And so one of the challenges will be, even if Biden is elected, who wants to maybe grow trade more than Trump does, the details are going to matter, and it's going to be hard to do that. China, other big issue, affects your interest, affects everybody's interest. Americans' attitudes towards China have never been worse. This goes back for 15 years, as you can see, overwhelmingly, both Democrats and Republicans have a negative view of China. That means even if Biden is elected, don't expect much of a change in some of the rhetoric about China. Maybe some of the actions will change, but there is support for being tougher on China on both the left and the right. What's interesting in this slide from the next slide from Pew is that in that middle column there, people say, is it more important to get tougher than to build a strong relationship with China on economic issues? 66% of Republicans say it's more important to be tough on China than to build a strong economic relationship. Only a third of Democrats agree with that statement. So I do think you could see some movement among Democratic support for loosening some of the sanctions on China, trying to rebuild the economic relationship. But again, go back to the fact that the public overall disapproves of China. Notice that the next line down there, the U.S. should try to promote human rights in China, even if it harms economic relations. Both Democrats and Republicans approve that. Finally, we all have heard concerns about Election Day. First off, more people are going to vote. That left-hand column, more people on the next slide. They're going to, 50% of Americans said they're going to vote early or absentee. But it really does matter what party you're in. Trump supporters are more likely to say they're going to vote on Election Day. Biden supporters say they're much more likely to vote early. If you look at this breakdown of where it'll be difficult to vote on election this year, that's both Election Day and earlier. The number to really look at is 60% of Democratic supporters say they expect it to be more difficult to vote in November. Only 35% of Republicans agree with that. But in both cases, these numbers are up dramatically from what they were in 2018, just 2 years ago. In terms of fraud, the Republicans are much more likely to expect fraud and see fraud in the election, even though, bear in mind, every study that's ever been done on this shows that fraud in American elections is infinitesimal. One study that was done that looked at well over 1 billion votes since Harry Truman was president. And if my memory serves me correctly, the percentage of fraud was 0.00037%, which is, to say it's a rounding error is an insult to rounding errors. It's just nothing. Finally, the question really is, if we don't know who's going to be president on election night, and this drags on, which everyone now assumes will be the case, is it going to cause trouble? And if among those who say they will not vote for Trump, 59% say if Trump wins, there's going to be trouble. And for those who will not vote for Biden, 50% say if Biden wins, there's going to be trouble. So the public is fully primed for trouble. And I think that's something to be very worried about. Okay, thank you very much. I've gone on too long. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Bruce, wow. Thank you very much. Just a huge amount of information to get through, and I wish we had another half hour to hear your additional input. I am aware of time, so I'll keep my question, and I'm going to say questions plural. You can give kind of rapid fire responses if you want, or choose which one you want to answer before I hand off to my counterparts. Back to one of your beginning slides on the ability of a sitting president to be reelected if there's a recession within 2 years of the election. The COVID-induced recession. Does that rest squarely on the president's shoulders to the voters who would maybe decide one way or the other? And then my second question is, okay, fine, Biden wins, and a lot of people here in Norway, and I'm sure the other Nordic countries, expect just an avalanche of kind of new trade deals and reductions of tariffs. A groundswell amongst the American electorate to make these changes based on the information that you've been sharing with us. But is there sufficient reason to believe that that would be one solid way that a Biden administration would maybe mend some bridges and extend an olive branch during its initial time in office? Thank you. Answer your first question, it is a unique recession. We've never had a recession induced by a pandemic. And so we just don't know. The reality is people are laid off. Now, on the other hand, until recently, many of them were getting subsidies from the government, which has at least cushioned the blow of this recession. So I actually think that while I do think it's going to hurt Trump simply because I think people say things aren't going well, we need to change. And, the change is Biden. And they won't understand Biden's economic plan. They don't know that it's going to work any better. They just want to change something. But
the reality is that this hasn't imposed the kind of burden on them that most recessions have, at least up to this point. Now, bear in mind, Congress hasn't extended the bailout, so people are going to be feeling things as we go through October. Yet there is an old saw in polling that economic events have to happen several months ahead of the election, because people have made up their mind before. And so I think that if there's going to be a time when a recession doesn't determine the outcome of re-election, this may be one of them. That's a good question. Now, in terms of trade, this is, I think, terribly important. I don't think the Biden administration will do much on trade for at least the first term. I think that we must remember that Obama did almost nothing on trade in the first term, and that was in part, his excuse was, look, I got this great recession to deal with. I got to rebuild the economy. Biden will have even more problems than Obama faced, and even though trade is increasingly supported by the American public, still strong doubts about trade among key Democratic Party constituency groups, notably the unions, but also environmental groups. And I just think it's a headache that he doesn't need. And it's not at all clear he could get an agreement through the Congress. And why would you have a fight over a divisive issue early on when you're trying to, get an infrastructure bill passed, or try to get more stimulus money passed, or correct a whole lot of things that you think Trump screwed up? So I think that's going to be a real limitation on the ability of I think the Biden people will try to fix the WTO simply because it has to be fixed. It doesn't work. I must admit, when I've talked to them privately, they aren't really at all convinced they can fix the WTO, but that seems to be their priority.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Peter?
Or I was going to say, Jason, could
Yep.
I jump in simply because my question kind of builds on what you just said about the WTO, because, a lot of the things you've been covering today has been about how different the Republican and Democrats and how different and diverse the voters really are, especially in this election. And then the one slide that stood out was how similar Americans felt about China, about trade, on those issues. And one of the typical rhetorics we hear in US elections is that I'm the president that's going to unite America and bring us together. That, firstly, are there things other than China and sort of a lukewarm feeling towards trade that unites America? And why wouldn't then Biden or Trump want to focus on trade, as it's one of the issues that actually brings people of different opinions together?
Well, I think, there's every evidence is that, Trump policies are aimed at his base, and his base, what we would find when we looked at, people who believe, say, trade destroyed jobs or lowered wages, it was old white men, basically, who believed that. That was the strongest demographic. And those are people who have voted and will vote for Donald Trump again. In terms of Biden clearly is running an election in general that says we need to come together, we need to, overcome this partisanship and work together. I must admit, if you look at the data, I'm not sure that's possible. I mean, I think we all think that's necessary, that would be best for the country and the world, by the way. But the divisions inside the country, the partisan divisions and the racial divisions and the gender divisions are so great that whether we can have a kumbaya moment and come back together, I'm cynically questioning that. I hope I'm wrong, because I think whoever wins, that's what the country needs, that's what the world needs, I think. If Trump gets reelected, I think it proves the point that we can't come together because the Biden message didn't work. If Biden wins, then the question is, can he actually pursue a set of policies that do bring the country together? And we'll see. I would point out to people that when Obama won in 2008, and the Democrats also gained control of the Senate. The Republican minority in those first 2 years filibustered 80% of all Obama proposals. During the height of the civil rights crisis in the 1960s, when Southern Democrats were trying to block civil rights legislation, 8% of legislation was filibustered. Now, it's easier to filibuster now because you don't have to get up and read the telephone book. You can just say, I'm going to filibuster, and then they pull the legislation off the floor. But nevertheless, do we expect that Mitch McConnell and the Republicans would not use that same tactic if they lose control of the Senate? I don't know. I mean, we'll see. But I think that would be a sign of division and an inability to overcome the division. And it does take two to tango. And I'm not so sure that either side is willing to compromise sufficiently. And I would say to people in the audience, I mean, if Biden is elected and you say, okay, now America's going to move on climate change, or they're going to move on this, or they're going to move on that, bear in mind that the Democrats may not control the Senate. And if they can't, that's going to be really difficult to get stuff done. And even if they do control the Senate, they're going to control by 1 or 2 votes. And the best example I can think of is a carbon tax. You know, I personally believe that we should have a carbon tax in the United States. It's inconceivable to me that conservative Democrats in the Democratic Party in the Senate would vote for a carbon tax. I mean, one of the senators from West Virginia is a Democrat, but it's a coal-producing state. Do we really think he's going to vote for a carbon tax? And that's one of the challenges Biden's going to face.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Alexandra. Peter, you were actually discussing the filibuster a little bit before the call, but feel free to ask whatever you'd like.
Yeah, well, I was going to pivot away from the filibuster and talk a little bit about some of the slides you put up about the non-college educated whites, and then also there was another slide that the pace of change elections picking up. And I'm wondering if there's a tie between or tie-in with the pace of change elections picking up to some of the issues you've just discussed in Alexandra, issues like that are driving out particular parts of any candidate's base or party's base. Like if this year it's going to be the Supreme Court, or it might have been Hillary Clinton, as you mentioned in 2016, the hatred of Hillary that really drove out the base. Is it that the U.S. demographics are changing so rapidly, and things that drove out the base, say in 2004 when gay marriage was on the ballot in a number of states to drive people to the polls, now it's widely accepted in the U.S. And now there's like another thing in the culture war, another issue about identity politics that drives a different base.
Well, it's interesting. I think certainly the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett, who everybody believes would vote against abortion if she's on the Supreme Court, I think is going to rally the evangelical community, the anti-abortion community, and solidify at least that base, if not increase. Because the reality is most Americans support abortion. So, it's only so many people you can rally around this issue. What we don't know is, will it rally the Democrats? That they'll be so angry about this that they will turn, some people go out to vote and we just, it remains to be seen. It is interesting, and I could be wrong, but you're right. What's interesting is one of the tactics that especially Republicans have used in the past is to put on state ballots very controversial issues that will mobilize their base, whether it could be bans or something else that would drive support for their voters in that particular state. I'm not aware of a lot of state level initiatives that are being done that time. Maybe they didn't work as well in the past as we thought they were going to. I don't know. Or maybe they're on there, but people haven't paid attention to them. But we'll see. It's an interesting tactic. And what it would appear the Republicans have been doing this time is to try to challenge the right to vote. In other words, make it harder to vote. The classic example recently is the governor of Texas. Given the fact that we know that a lot of people are going to do mail-in ballots, and some states have actually put out boxes around the cities to kind of, you can just put your mail on, you don't have to mail it because we don't trust the postal service to deliver it on time. You can drive by and just put it in this box. It's not a mailbox, it's a voting box. Has limited the number of those boxes to maybe one a county. And some of these counties are, I mean, Harris County in Texas is 2,000 square miles. You'd have to drive for a half an hour to get to this thing. Now, he says it's for security. States that do this already say we've never had a problem with the security of these boxes, but you know, there seem to be efforts to make it harder to vote, and that's why the polling data show that both sides, but especially Democrats, say it's going to be harder to vote this year. What is interesting, and you know, my pet peeve has always been, why don't we require people to vote? I mean, only 60% of Americans vote, and in a democracy, that's not much of an endorsement of the system. Australia does it; it seems to work. But when we at Pew did a survey and asked people, would you like to be the nation to require people to vote? Only 17% of Americans said we would like to. We think the nation people should be required to vote. So, you know, we are a libertarian nation. We're not going to go down that road. So, when you aren't required to vote, there are going to be all sorts of ways to fiddle with who gets to vote.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Peter. Steve, the floor is yours, and I realize we're running short on time. We might run a couple minutes over here, but I would like to stay pretty tight with schedule. Go ahead, Steve.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks, Bruce, for your presentation. Hey, say we haven't talked much about swing states. We've been talking more about the national opinion in America. But any thoughts on, Trump seems to be extremely good at mobilizing his base, and if you look at his key issues, law and order, and who's better at bringing the economy back? It's me, because it was COVID that took the economy away, not me. So how does that fare in your mind with Biden and in some of the key states like Florida, Pennsylvania, and so on at this point?
Well, in most of those states, Biden is currently leading. So at least at this point, it would appear that those issues you raised, which I think are legitimate, kind of questions to raise about those swing states, doesn't seem to have an effect. Now, the reality is Clinton was leading in many of those states at this point in 2016. In fact, even though, as I pointed out in this most recent NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, Clinton's leading by 14 points. She was leading by 14 points at this point nationally in 2016. So you got to take all of this stuff with a little grain of salt, or a big grain of salt. But, I do think that there is evidence that Trump has not been successful in returning manufacturing jobs to some of those Great Lakes states where he promised to bring them back. There has been some jobs that have come back, but we're certainly not back to where we were several years ago. Whether that has percolated into people's minds or whether they kind of believe the rhetoric, because the Trump gets out on the campaign trail and claims I brought back all these jobs, and then the fact checkers come in and say, well, no, actually you haven't. We're still down the number of manufacturing jobs. I look at the attention span of the average voter is pretty narrow, and I think Trump, as a good salesman, understands if you get the message out early, the correction of the message is never heard, right? People say, to give you guys an example, I lived next door to a woman here in Cambridge, she was born in this house, she's 70-some years old. I think she's a Trump supporter, I don't know. But she said the other day that she wasn't concerned about COVID because we have a vaccine. I said to her, no, we don't. She said, well, no, the president said we have a vaccine. So the president has actually never said that. He said we're about to get a vaccine, but she actually heard it as we have a vaccine. So I think that, we have to understand that these messages kind of get distorted, sometimes intentionally, and average people don't pay much attention, which is sad in a democracy. I think we should all pay more attention than we do, but it's a reality. And so in some of these swing states, it's entirely possible that people will. I mean, to give you an example, in 2016, I come from a place called Butler County, Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania. The unemployment rate on election day in 2016 was below the national average. It was below the state average. The employment rate was higher, and it voted 67% for Trump. Now, if it was only the economy stupid, they should have voted for Clinton, because the Obama presidency had been really good for this county. So there's a lot more going on in people's minds than that.
Thanks, Bruce.
Bruce, thank you very much. I've been going back and forth as you've been answering that last question on if we should entertain more questions. I'm going to draw the line here, but I'm going to basically encourage anyone that's been on the call that has an additional question to get those to me or to the respective AmChams, and we will get answers on those, if that's okay with you. I'm promising work on your behalf, so publicly I realize, so I want to make sure that's okay. But I saw we had a couple questions. I think you addressed one or two of the questions in the chat through your answers to the others. So with that, I want to thank you very much again for spending time, especially on this side of kind of the release of your big report. It's certainly been a pleasure and an informative experience for us all. So
one second, I will send you a copy of that report, which comes out October the 7th. It's about how do we deal with challenges facing Europe and America in 2021, whoever wins.
Perfect.
And everything from how we deal with China, how we deal with new technologies, how we deal with the economic crisis, how we deal with the pandemic. Happy to share it with you, and happy to have you share it with your members if you think they'll be interested.
They will absolutely be interested, and I really appreciate that. And I think I speak for my counterparts when I say yes, that will absolutely be shared widely within our network. So again, thank you. Have a great rest of the day to you and to everyone, and we will be back in touch maybe after the election to see
That'll be maybe February when we finally know the outcome.
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully not too far after the election, but in any event, thank you very much, Bruce.
Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye-bye.